CSS float-based elements are probably one of the most common means of creating CSS layout. With a CSS float, an element can be pushed to the left or the right, allowing other elements to wrap around it. We've seen CSS floats being used for images in previous examples. However, it's extremely useful when working with layout. In order to begin with our little exercise, I've created a file here called float1.html. And if you're working along with me, you can go to the source folder and find in Chapter 5, in the position folder, float1.html. If you open up that file, you'll see that it is connected to a simple CSS file called firstfloat. There's nothing on firstfloat at the moment. We're going to actually put in some of that information ourselves. So let's do this. First, let's look at the code for the HTML. What I've done is create 4 divs, each with the class of floater. After that, we have another div with a class of text box, and within there is some very simple H1 and paragraph text. If we look at it in our design view, what we can see is basically that each of these divs are block level elements that are taking up the exact amount of space that's available to it. What we want to do is limit the size of these boxes so that they will not appear one underneath each other, but rather next to each other. We then want to have the headline text here appear underneath the 4 floating boxes. So to begin with, let's go to our CSS and let's turn on a new CSS rule. What we want to do is to create a new custom class. And if you remember, the boxes on top have the class of floater. So we'll start it with a period and then say floater. We're going to put this in the firstfloat.css file. Clicking OK, we can now start to determine how these boxes are going to look. So let's see what we can do. First of all, if we go to the category called box, let's limit the width of each of these boxes. I'm just going to put in 100 pixels and 100 pixels for the height as well as the width. If you press apply, you can see that all of these boxes are now been limited as they are here. We can put in a little bit of padding in here as well. How about 10 pixels each? And that's created things a little bit bigger. We can also put maybe a little bit of margin around each of these just so that they're going to be separated a little bit. So I'll come in here and I'll just say something like 5 for the margin. Now you'll notice that each of these are separated as well. They're being pushed a little bit off the edge of the body. We'll give them background colors as well. Now that we have all of these in place, let's see what they look like. Well, there's not really much that's going on here. It looks exactly as we saw before. There's still block level elements that are floating around the way we expected them to. However, at this point, we're going to attempt to get all of these boxes to be next to each other merely by going to the category called box and setting the float to left. When we click OK, we see what's going on. Well, first of all, the first box is not going to be affected, even though it's floating left. Anything before that box will not actually be affected. However, all the other boxes are appearing one next to each other as opposed to underneath each other. But let's take a look at what's happening here with the headline text. Well, there's an unwanted effect. What is essentially happening is same thing that we saw when we were floating images inside of our paragraphs. Because these are floating to the left, the elements that come after it take up whatever space is available and sort of sneak in right next to box number 4. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what we want. We want some headline text to appear underneath these 4 boxes. So in order to do this, we're going to have to create a really interesting effect. It's the means of turning off a float. And we do this by using the clear property. Elements after a floating element will flow around it, as you can see here. And to avoid this, we use the clear property, which specifies which side of an element either floating elements are not allowed. So if we look at our code, we can see that this box has a class of text box. Switch back to my design view, and let's go to our CSS and attempt to turn off the floating effect that is happening for this text box. So if I come in here and state a new CSS rule, and we call it text box, since I had selected it, it appears naturally. I'm going to click OK, and if you don't have it here yourself, just make sure that you enter in .textbox. Now what we're going to do is ensure that the text box is going to be underneath the other ones by turning off the floating effect. And we do this by going to the category call box and setting the clear to both. I want to have both because it's not just left and right that I'm clearing all elements above it. So when we set this to clear both and we press apply, check it out. Excellent. That's exactly what we want to have happen. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes floating next to each other up on top, and this element right here is not being affected. So if you want something to not be affected by the floats above it, you take this element that's underneath and you apply clear both. Now let's take a look at this in the browser just to show you exactly what this clear is going to be doing. I'm going to save the HTML page and the CSS, and now if I shrink this browser, you can sort of see what's going on. Notice that I did not define a width for this particular div right here, so it's going to be resized as I go along. But look what happens to the boxes. When you are using a float, it's going to float on the left as it is doing right here, as long as there is space available for it to do so. Now, if that space had been made smaller, as I'm doing right now, notice what happens. Box number 4 is pushed underneath the other elements. If I continue to do this, 3 and 4 are pushed underneath, until eventually, if you were to continue, this would go down to just one box. I can't make this any smaller, but if I could, it would go down one box underneath each other. So this is pretty flexible. It creates a really interesting way of working with your designs. But it's also one of the most common means of creating CSS layout. So come back in the next video, and when we do, we're going to start creating a full layout design, taking all of the different positionings that we've been working with up to this point and assembling them in a much more common style of layout.